In this lecture, I'm going to provide an introduction to the cerebellum, which includes a coverage of the external and internal anatomy of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, also known as the little brain, primarily functions to help regulate movement and posture, and this occurs indirectly by adjusting the motor output from the motor cortices. And some examples when we think about cerebellar function is when we think about lesions to the cerebellum. If there are deterioration or disease affecting the neurons, we know that motor output is retained. So the motor neurons housed within the cerebral cortex, as well as in the frontal lobe and the brainstem region, are still able to output and activate muscle. However, with the cerebellum, that coordinated motor output will be impaired. And one example is cerebellar ataxia. And this is a condition that involves a lack of coordination between movements of various parts of the body. And cerebellar ataxia is usually referenced to a body part. And the action that is affected, such as walking, which is gait, or arm movement. And the how of the mechanisms of the cerebellum is that the neurons act essentially as a comparator. In other words, the neurons will compare an intended movement, and those are outputs from the frontal lobe, with the actual movements. So, in order to make this comparison, the cerebellum must bring in feedback from the segment that has been activated. And so, this is just one area of many where the nervous system takes in real time feedback and uses that feedback immediately to adjust the motor output and thereby affecting the physical function. The cerebellum will also modify what are called central motor programs, and these are this is a way to explain how neurons are hardwired together that will assist a repeatable muscular action. And so by having that redundancy, the cerebellum will help to minimize movement errors. And the cerebellum is also involved in motor learning. So the ability to perform motor tasks more efficiently and smoothly with practice. When we take a look at the surface anatomy from the posterior view of the cerebellum, we notice a similarity with the cerebrum in that the cerebellum has two hemispheres, both a right and a left hemisphere. The hemisphere here, as opposed to the cerebral cortex, which is separated by a fissure, here is separated by a continuous tissue called the vermis. And that's a longitudinal midline strip of tissue that's consistent with the hemispheres. And the vermis divides the cerebellum into right and left hemispheres. Now, the external surface is defined by what are called folia, and these are transverse convolutions located, or just that gives the texture of the external part of the cerebellum. If we take a look towards the bottom part of the slide, here we see the medulla that blends into the spinal cord. So just on the anterior side of the cerebellum is the continuation of the base of the brain tissue into the lower part of the brain stem. If we take a look at the internal anatomy in this cross section, once again, we do see some similarities with the cerebral cortex in that there's a cerebellar cortex as well. However, different from the cerebral cortex is that the cerebellar cortex is much, much thicker than what we see in the cerebral cortex, indicating this darker area of tissue houses a large number of neurons, but those neurons are packed into a much more dense volume of tissue. Uh, within the inner part of the cerebellum here in this cross section, we see quite a bit of white matter. So there are a number of axon-only regions on the internal part of the cerebellum, but buried inside that white matter, you can see all this gray here, we have what are called the deep cerebellar nuclei. And these are clusters of neurons that will send outputs of the cerebellum to various parts of the nervous system that we'll cover here shortly. So we have our white matter, as just indicated a moment ago, and these are the axons that connect the cortex and the deep nuclei, the deep cerebellar nuclei. And so the deep cerebellar nuclei, there are three pairs, one on the right, one on the left. And from the medial to lateral, these are named the fastigious, interpositus, and dentate nuclei. We'll see that here on the next slide. And the function of these nuclei is that they serve as the outputs of the cerebellum. And this includes what are called vestibular nuclei. These are neurons that receive inputs from the vestibular apparatus housed within the middle ear, the inner ear, that will provide information about head position and head acceleration. And that contributes to our ability to maintain upright, standing, or seated posture. In terms of inputs to the cerebellum, all levels of the spinal cord, all levels of the central nervous system provide input to the cerebellum, and that includes afferent pathways. And so afferent pathways will synapse both into the very thick cerebellar cortex as well as to the deep nuclei. If we take a closer look at the deep nuclei, we start with the most lateral, largest one, and that's the dentate nuclei. So housed over here are a number of cell bodies that will send out projections to the motor and the premotor cortices. So these are axons that will ascend towards the superior part of the nervous system to the frontal lobe, and these will influence motor planning and eventually the execution of motor tasks. If we move to the middle part or the middle cluster of neurons, or called the interposed nuclei, these will output projections that will influence lateral descending systems. So a lateral descending system are axons that will travel inferior along the spinal cord, but will affect motor neurons that are more laterally located within those within the gray matter of the ventral horns. The most interior part here in green is a cluster of neurons referred to as the fastigial nuclei, and these ones will impact the medial descending systems. So depending upon the degree of activation of the deep cerebellar nuclei, we may have almost selective activation of those more medially located muscles or the more laterally located muscles. But for overall human function, there's a somewhat of a combination of outputs that will work together to promote a smooth and efficient execution of motor tasks. So this video ends our brief overview of the cerebellum.